A growing number of prominent voices are warning that Britain may be heading straight towards another recession. From business leaders to senior officials at the Bank of England, concerns are mounting that the UK economy is slowing sharply and that Rachel Reeves and the government's current trajectory could push the nation into yet another downturn. John Roberts, the founder of FTSE 250 retailer AO, said he felt the country was heading into a downturn because of rising inflation and mounting job cuts. We've lived through a few recessions in the last 25 years, and I think we're heading into another one, he said. That view is not isolated. The sense of unease stretches across the business community, households, and even the Bank of England. Alan Taylor, a senior Bank of England official, said the economy was in danger of recession. He warned the risk was now of a more forceful downturn where recession dynamics start to kick in that can be very difficult to contain or even reverse. The numbers currently are not great, and the latest word coming out of the International Monetary Fund offers little comfort. According to the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, British living standards are poised to improve at the slowest rate in the G7, according to the International Monetary Fund. In a blow to Sir Keir Starmer's pledge to raise living standards across the UK, the IMF warned that higher inflation and a weak economy meant real growth per person would be just 0.5% in 2026. That compares with 1.8% in the US and 1.2% in Japan. The Eurozone will also outpace Britain, with growth in GDP per head of 0.9%. This forecast puts Britain at the bottom of the G7 league table for living standards growth. The IMF's message is stark. While other major economies will continue to grow, Britain's growth per person will stagnate. For working families, that means any improvement to living standards will be marginal at best. This will be a massive blow for Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour government. Since taking office, they've consistently framed their economic strategy around a single core promise: to raise living standards for working people.
In the first year, we've raised wages as well, both in the private sector plus the minimum wage, which means people have got a bit more money coming into their pocket. And so at this stage, that'll all be set out in the budget, but the focus will very much be on living standards and making sure people feel better off.
But so we're laser focused on making sure that we reduce cost and we work with businesses to make sure that they can thrive.
But you know, people are not feeling better off.
Well,
When will they feel better off?
we need to do more, much more, to make sure that people feel better off. And I know that at the next election, I will be judged, rightly judged, by people on the basis: have living standards gone up? Do I feel better? Do I feel better off?
That pledge has been at the heart of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves' fiscal plans. It has been at the heart of their speeches, the government's mission-led approach to growth. But the latest IMF forecast cuts directly against that message. The projections make one thing clear: the government is not on track to deliver its goal of raising living standards. With Britain projected to have the slowest improvement in living standards across the entire G7, just 0.5% growth per person in 2026, the government faces a harsh political reality. To make matters worse, official figures published on Tuesday, the 14th of October, showed that unemployment jumped to a 4-year high of 4.8% in the 3 months to August. Rising unemployment and sluggish growth are a dangerous combination, and both are flashing warning signs at the same time. Adding to the anxiety, Athanasios Vanvaktis, a deputy director at the IMF, said, "Clearly the markets are concerned about the UK economy. We've seen more volatility in the UK compared to other advanced economies recently." Vanvaktis is right. The UK has experienced sharp and unpredictable movements in government bond yields, the pound, and overall investor sentiment towards British assets. As one report summarised it, long-term government bond yields have surged in 2025, rattling investors from Tokyo to Toronto. While this is partly a global phenomenon, tied to swollen debt burdens, stubborn inflation and changing investor attitudes, the UK has been hit particularly hard. Its 30-year gilt yields have reached levels not seen since the late 1990s. The result is an escalation in borrowing costs for governments, corporations and households, and in the UK, a narrowing of fiscal space ahead of a crucial 2025 autumn budget. UK gilt yields have been swinging more dramatically than those in the US, Germany or Japan. This volatility reflects deep investor nervousness about Britain's fiscal policy, especially with Chancellor Rachel Reeves expected to announce further tax rises in November's budget. The pound sterling has also experienced bigger ups and downs in recent months, underscoring how uncertain global markets are about the UK's direction on growth, inflation and debt. Despite this turbulence, the IMF did offer one modest piece of good news. The IMF modestly increased its forecast for economic growth in the UK for this year from 1.2% to 1.3% and slightly downgraded it for 2026 also to 1.3% amid concerns over the labour market. Over the year as a whole, the economic body expects the UK to be the second fastest growing economy in the G7, behind a 2% expansion of gross domestic product in the US. At first glance, this seems like something the Chancellor will likely highlight in her upcoming budget speech, that Britain is projected to be the second fastest growing economy in the G7. It's an optimistic headline and one that might sound reassuring, but that figure doesn't tell the full story. When you shift the focus from total GDP to GDP per capita, the picture looks far less impressive. Total GDP simply measures the overall size of the economy, while GDP per capita divides that total by the population. In a country like Britain, where the population has been growing rapidly, largely due to immigration, headline GDP can increase even as the average person's living standards stagnate or fall. GDP per head is often used as a proxy for living standards. It has fallen in the UK over the past 2 years as soaring immigration has seen the population grow faster than the economy. The Prime Minister made raising living standards a central priority of his Labour government, setting an ambition for Britain to deliver the fastest growth in per capita GDP in the G7 for 2 straight years by the end of the Parliament. The IMF's forecast suggests that goal remains well out of reach, with GDP per person expected to grow faster in every major economy next year, apart from South Africa. That is a sobering assessment. While total GDP growth might give the illusion of progress, GDP per capita, the figure that truly reflects how much wealth each person gains, shows the opposite. The UK is projected to have the slowest GDP per capita growth in the entire G7 next year. Chances are this is not a forecast that Rachel Reeves or the Treasury will be eager to highlight. That places Britain firmly at the bottom among major advanced economies, the worst in the G7 when it comes to living standards growth. This matters because GDP per capita tells us how much money the economy is growing per person. It adjusts for population increases, showing whether people are actually becoming better off. When population growth outpaces economic growth, the pie gets larger, but each person's slice gets smaller. Even if the economy grows in total, the population grows faster. Individuals on average become no better off, or even poorer. In plain terms, the IMF's forecast is saying that Britons will see the weakest improvement in living standards of any major Western nation in 2026. For a government that campaigned on the promise of raising living standards for working people, that is a damning verdict. The fund also lowered Britain's overall growth prospects just weeks before the Chancellor is set to launch another round of tax increases in her November budget. The IMF trimmed its forecast for UK growth next year by 0.1% to 1.3% and warned that a new trade deal struck with the US would not offset the economic damage from higher tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, inflation continues to linger, and not just at a mildly uncomfortable level. The IMF's assessment of inflation paints a troubling picture for households and policymakers alike. In a further blow, it also warned that prices in Britain were rising even faster than in some developing economies, such as Peru and Senegal, as higher taxes and raising household bills keep inflation higher for longer. Britain is now expected to experience the highest inflation in the G7 over the next 2 years, eroding any growth in household incomes. The IMF singled out the UK and the US for notable increases in inflation compared with its forecasts a year ago. Its latest World Economic Outlook, the IMF predicted the UK price rises would average 3.4% this year. That is much higher than a prediction of 2.1% that made last October. Inflation is predicted to ease to 2.5% in 2026, but not return to the Bank of England's 2% target until the end of next year. The IMF warned that inflation was likely to continue rising in 2025, partly because of changes in regulated prices, such as utility and energy bills. The Bank of England has also blamed the Chancellor's £2.5 billion employer national insurance increase. This means the UK's cost of living crisis isn't over, it's merely evolving. Even as inflation cools, it remains higher than every other G7 nation, and that continued pressure on prices will erode whatever modest wage gains workers manage to secure. In practical terms, that means most families won't feel any real improvement in their finances for at least another year. The UK's challenges are not just statistical, they're structural. Productivity growth has been weak for more than a decade, public debt is high, and the government's room to manoeuvre fiscally is limited. Every new tax rise makes it more expensive for businesses to hire, invest, and grow. Meanwhile, high borrowing costs and weak confidence are dragging down consumer spending and business investment alike. Even though the IMF doesn't forecast an outright recession in its baseline prediction, GDP is expected to grow by 1.3%. In both 2025 and 2026, it's clear the economy is teetering on the edge. Many economists describe this as a near-stall economy, one bad shock away from tipping into negative territory. The risk factors are everywhere. Global growth is slowing. The US and China are still locked in trade tensions. Energy costs remain volatile. Domestically, the government faces political pressure to raise more revenue while also stimulating growth, a difficult balancing act that can go easily wrong. The UK's financial markets are already signalling unease. Rising gilt yields and a volatile pound are warning signs that investors are demanding higher returns to hold British debt, a reflection of declining confidence. If the upcoming budget fails to convince markets that the government has a credible plan to grow the economy and manage debt, borrowing costs could rise further, squeezing public finances even more. For ordinary Britons, the consequences of those macroeconomic trends are deeply personal. Higher inflation, slower growth, and rising taxes mean paychecks stretch less far. Mortgage rates remain elevated, rents continue to climb, and energy bills are stubbornly high. Even as official figures show growth, life for many feels like it's getting harder, not easier. Alan Taylor's warning about recession dynamics captures the risk perfectly. Once these dynamics take hold, when businesses stop hiring, consumers pull back on spending, and companies stop hiring. So, is the UK heading towards another recession? According to the IMF's latest projections, no, not yet. The fund does not forecast an outright contraction. However, what it does reveal is a deeply fragile economy, one that's barely growing and could easily tip into recession if conditions deteriorate any further. Let's look at the numbers. The IMF expect headline GDP growth of just 1.3% in 2026, sluggish by any standard. GDP per capita, which measures real living standards, is set to rise by only 0.5%. Inflation is projected to remain above target at 2.5%, while unemployment is already climbing, reaching a 4-year high of 4.8%. Technically, the economy is still expanding, but at such a slow pace that most people will feel no real improvement. Economists call this a near-stall economy, where growth is barely positive, productivity is weak, and household finances remain under strain. So, while Britain isn't officially in a recession, it's uncomfortably close to one. The risk lies in how fragile this recovery truly is. With tax rises expected in November's budget, any policy misstep could be enough to push the UK from stagnation into a full-blown downturn. Do you think the UK is heading into a recession? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.